Alright, so in this video we're going to look at, actually Zeno had several paradoxes, but this is, I guess, kind of my own version of one of his paradoxes. And it went something like this. The basic idea is the same, no matter how the idea is explained, it's the same basic idea. So if you had a runner that was going to run a distance of 100 meters. So going to run from 0 to 100. Well, we've all watched Olympic races. We watch the 100-meter race, and we see the runner start at 0 and go through the entire 100 meters. And so Zeno, being the philosopher that he was, started thinking too much, like philosophers tend to do, and he said, well, if the runner starts at 0, before he or she gets to 100, he's got it. Let's just pretend it's a he. He's got to get to 50, right, which is halfway, of course, and then starting right once the runner's at 50, he's also got to get halfway from 50 to 100. So the distance between 50 and 100 is 50, and half of that distance is 25, which would put the runner at 75. Right? So he's got to get half of the entire distance first, and then before he gets the second half of the entire distance, he's got to get half of that distance. Right? Okay, now he's got a quarter of the distance left, but before he can get through that quarter of the distance, he's got to get through half of that distance. Right? So from 75 to 100 is 25, and half of that distance would be 12 and a half. So that would put him at what, 87 and a half meters? And if you continue to think in this manner, then you could continue this forever. The runner's got to get half of that distance, and then he's got to get half of that distance, and then he's got to get half of that distance. And if you continue that forever, you would never get to 100. This is kind of like the idea in algebra when you talk about graphing an asymptote. Right? It's kind of what happens when you have a graph that's getting closer and closer and closer to some value, but never actually touching. And this is what Zeno's paradox is how is it possible that we visually see the runner go from 0 to 100, but if we think about it in this mathematical way where we go half of the distance and then half of that distance and then half of that distance, the runner would never get to 100. So of course something is wrong, and this goes back to maybe we shouldn't trust philosophers who don't know their mathematics, or something like that. It's a good thought, but this really isn't a paradox, because we can resolve this issue if we know just a little bit about some mathematics. And Zeno was thinking about these things long before ideas in calculus were well known at all. So the type of thinking that Zeno needed to resolve this issue just wasn't common knowledge when he was alive. So a hint as to how you might resolve this: see if you can find some kind of pattern in find some kind of pattern in these numbers that I've listed out. So let's see. You might start thinking of a sequence of numbers where the first number in your sequence maybe is 50, and then to get to 75, the second number in your sequence would be half of that. Right? So what did we do? We took 50 plus 25 to get to 75. And the third number in the sequence, we took half of that, so this would be our sequence. And if we start adding those numbers together, that's how I was getting, right? 50 plus 25 got me to 75, plus 12 and a half got me to 87 and a half, right? And if we add those numbers, we just call that a series. Okay, so see if you can think about a pattern, right? How are we getting from the first number in the sequence to the second number to the third number, so on and so forth. And see if you can think of a way that you might be able to actually add these numbers up and come up with an answer that makes a lot of sense, so that it's really not a paradox, that what you come up with mathematically would match with what you actually see in the physical world. And then it's not a paradox at all, then it makes perfect sense. So anyway, that's something kind of fun to think about, and that's what philosophers do, I guess, with their spare time, and sometimes it's worthwhile, sometimes it's not, but it was one of Zeno's famous paradoxes.